A wind whipped through the cypress groves of the Mississippi Delta, carrying the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of iron from distant cotton gins. At the Whitmore plantation, 3 figures stood framed by the fading amber light of dusk: Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah. Each barely 19, their eyes reflecting something darker than the bayou night itself. Their plantation kin had been dying, one by one, whispers trailing them like shadows. Neighbors claimed the girls had invoked something far older than sin. Every family has secrets. Some rot quietly, others erupt in fire. It began subtly in the spring of 1843. The Whitmore patriarch, a man who prided himself on exact ledgers and immaculate stables, was found slumped over the breakfast table, a faint sheen on his lips, a book of receipts still clutched in his hand. Next, the matriarch, the very image of Southern propriety, collapsed mid-afternoon while supervising the cotton gin. Friends and kin murmured over tea and biscuits that something was amiss. By midsummer, even the overseer's son, a strapping youth who'd mocked the girls for their quiet ways, was dead in the garden with no mark on his body, only a vacant gaze staring at the heavens. Neighbors smelled the tang of smoke before the fire, saw birds circle overhead, and felt the floorboards vibrate under unseen footsteps. Whispers traveled faster than the Delta riverboats. "They've cursed us. The Triplets, they are too evil for God." Yet, no one acted. The same men who counted the cotton bales, who slapped hands and praised themselves for order, chose to step aside when the girls passed. What would you have done if fear rooted every hand and mind around you? The narrative core of the Delta that year was the eerie rhythm of deaths. Each incident seemed calibrated, the consequences tailored. Rosa, the eldest, had a habit of lingering in the kitchens, inspecting the stove, tasting sauces, tracing herbs with careful fingers. Dinah moved silently among the stables, whispering to horses as if imparting dark secrets. Sarah, the youngest, preferred the library, tracing ledgers and family records, annotating margins in tiny script, her fingers ink-stained, as if plotting invisible equations no one could decipher. By August 21st, the plantation had transformed into a theater of suspicion. Doors were bolted from the inside, servants huddled in corners, and guests declined invitations, citing phantom illnesses. The Triplets, however, were everywhere, yet nowhere present in the laughter at dinner, the shadows on the veranda, the faint echo of song drifting down the hallways. They left behind only the evidence of absence: a turned chair, a dish licked clean, a ledger misaligned by half an inch. The Delta itself seemed complicit. Frogs croaked over the slow roll of evening fog. Cypress knees jutted like skeletal fingers from the swamp. Cotton fields swayed under a hazy sun, and the smell of decaying leaves carried whispers of what was to come. Each plant, each gust, each shadow felt purposeful, almost sentient. The girls walked through it all like specters, their every action measured, their intentions hidden beneath innocence. A peculiar entry was noted in the overseer's journal on August 23, 1843. Something in their gaze unsettles the men. Not fear of labor, but something else. I cannot name it. They are quiet when we speak, yet the house trembles. The Triplets' neighbors were trapped in a web of observation without understanding. On the porch of the neighboring Henderson estate, a man leaned over the railing, swatting at flies, and muttered about the strange coincidences. A misplaced ledger, a kettle that boiled over without fire, chickens found dead without predator marks. Yet he returned home each night, pretending nothing was amiss, muttering to himself that superstition was safer than truth. Vivid patterns emerged. Each family member who opposed the girls or demanded obedience fell ill first in minor ways: headaches, chills, nausea. Then the more severe, irreversible events followed. Small children began to imitate the girls' behavior. scratching symbols into the dirt, humming tunes that seemed older than memory. The housekeeper, elderly and wise in old ways, kept her distance, muttering that the girls carried the curse of something older than the plantation itself. By September, the Delta's whispers coalesced into fear so tangible it had a weight. Visitors arrived to find gates locked, servants pale, dogs unchained yet unbarking. The girls were seen carrying baskets to the river, feeding the crows, and singing quietly a lullaby only birds recognized. Was it music or incantation? No one could say. The air itself felt heavy with expectation, with inevitability. Rhetorical curiosity lingered like morning mist. What forces, human or otherwise, could orchestrate a chain of deaths with such precision, so quietly, that the witnesses themselves became complicit? And if the triplets were capable of this now, what was their ultimate plan? As the sun dipped below the horizon on September 15, 1843, a sudden scream echoed across the delta. A neighbor had discovered the latest victim in a shallow ditch behind the orchard. This time, it was not the patriarch or a servant, but the local magistrate, a man known for his derision toward the girls. His ledger lay open beside him, ink smeared. The delta held its breath. The whisper traveled faster than the river. The girls. They are beyond human reckoning. And somewhere, across the moss-covered fields and the dark water of the bayou, Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah watched. Their faces illuminated by lantern light through the shuttered windows. Each knew that the next act would require someone to notice, but not too closely. Darkness bent the river. The morning mist clung to the cypress knees like tattered silk, damp and earthy, carrying the scent of stagnant water and the faint smoke of distant hearths. Somewhere upstream, a heron flapped against the gray light, wings slicing the fog. On the Whitmore porch, Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah moved in synchronized silence, their bare feet whispering against the weathered planks. Each step was deliberate, each glance calculated, as though the plantation itself had become an extension of their will. The stakes were simple yet deadly. Anyone who underestimated them would not live to speak of it. By September 22nd, 1843, the pattern of deaths had spread beyond the immediate Whitmore family. Neighboring plantations began to feel the tension. A driver returning from Natchez noted that the Whitmore fields seemed almost empty of labor, yet the cotton stalks were neatly trimmed. The overseer muttered curses, claiming it was witchcraft, while the plantation children watched, memorizing every subtle movement of the triplets. In kitchens across the delta, doors were bolted, knives were counted, meals served with suspicion. The triplets were masters of observation. Dinah lingered near the stables one morning, noting that the horses grew restless when a local carpenter arrived to repair fencing. She whispered to herself, words meant only for the delta air. Attention precedes action. That day, the carpenter cut himself on a rusty blade. It was an accident. Everyone agreed, but the timing was uncanny. The overseer scowled, muttering about bad luck, but Rosa simply tilted her head and smiled faintly, as if confirming some invisible equation. Neighbors whispered. Doors were bolted. At the same time, Sarah spent long hours in the Whitmore Library, tracing genealogies of families along the river. She studied ledgers, baptismal records, and marriage certificates, mapping connections that others ignored. The girls' reach extended far beyond the plantation borders. They knew which families held grudges, who owed money, who had slaves recently sold or purchased. Every death was a node in an invisible web, every illness a calculated ripple. By October, the delta felt like a stage set for something unspeakable. The swamps hummed with insects and the low vibration of hidden crocodiles. Fog crept along levees, hiding footsteps, carrying secrets between plantations. Farmers smelled smoke, though no fire burned. Fowls squawked in warning, yet no predator lurked. The triplets moved through this theater like conductors, orchestrating tension and observation with surgical precision. Neighbors acted as silent enablers. When a Whitmore servant appeared ill after handling dinnerware, other families said nothing, fearing reprisal or misunderstanding. Children were warned not to speak. Women glanced away when they passed the porch, and men claimed busyness as excuse for absence. What would you do if survival demanded complicity? Every glance turned into an unspoken agreement. See nothing, speak nothing. On October 3rd, an incident escalated the tension. The local magistrate's wife, Mrs. Langley, had grown suspicious of the girls after noticing her husband's sudden collapse. She sent a messenger to the Whitmore plantation under pretense of delivering supplies. The messenger returned pale-faced, claiming the girls had been nowhere near the kitchen when the magistrate became ill. Mrs. Langley whispered to her husband that the girls must be witches. The magistrate only coughed and nodded, unsure whether to believe her or fear his own household. Pattern, precision, power. Meanwhile, Rosa discovered a letter tucked within an old ledger, detailing a transaction between two plantation families, a sale of children from one family to another. Rosa's eyes scanned the names, circling dates and prices. She folded the paper with care and placed it in a hidden compartment in the floorboards beneath her bed. "They think we forget," she whispered, "but we remember everything." This paper would serve as a guide, a map of grievances waiting to be balanced. The delta itself seemed complicit. The river, brown and swollen from autumn rains, whispered against levees. Frogs croaked in discordant harmony. Mosquitoes filled the air with relentless hum, and the cypress trees shifted slightly in the wind, their bark like the wrinkled skin of old men. Each sound, each smell, each movement carried meaning for the triplets, who understood the swamp better than anyone else. On October 7th, a farmer reported seeing the girls near the edge of the levee at dawn. They carried wicker baskets filled with herbs, roots, and small vials. Their movements were purposeful, unhurried, almost ceremonial. The farmer, a man who prided himself on skepticism, told no one, fearing ridicule. The truth was too dangerous to voice aloud. Curiosity spiraled. How much of the horror was orchestrated, and how much born of fear itself? Could the deaths and accidents be coincidence, or was every misstep by those around the plantation a reaction to the girl's unseen hand? By mid-October, the body count rose quietly. A neighbor's son fell ill after tasting dinner prepared with care by a visiting servant, a servant who swore the meal was untouched by the girls. Yet timing and location aligned too neatly. A single cough, a faint convulsion, and then stillness. Conversations in Natchez and Vicksburg began to carry a muted dread. Avoid the Whitmore daughters. Avoid their kitchens. Avoid the eye contact. A short excerpt from a local diary, dated October 15, 1843. They smile when you speak, yet the air shifts with their passing. One cannot help but wonder, are these girls the work of men, or some spirit older than our river? By late October, the girls had learned to manipulate both perception and fear. Dinah taught herself to hum low notes that unsettled animals and humans alike. Rosa practiced gestures in the mirrors of the big house, perfecting subtle intimidation without a word. Sarah documented everything meticulously, creating coded charts of illness, death, and reactions that only they could read. Silence observed. Visitors to the plantation began to describe oddities, doors that would not close, animals behaving erratically, shadows cast in angles impossible under natural light. Bystanders, whether fearful or complicit, enabled the girl's growing legend. A nearby mill owner witnessed Rosa standing by the river with hands raised, muttering quietly to herself. He did not approach, choosing to tell no one. Fear had become currency, and the triplets held the market. The culmination came one chilly evening in late October. The sun sank low over the delta, reflecting orange and gray across the levees. The girls convened in the attic of the Whitmore house, the only space untouched by visitors. The room smelled of cedar and ink, dust motes drifting lazily in lantern light. Here, they consolidated knowledge of the month, who had grown suspicious, which deaths aligned with expectations, which families would require attention next. The plan, simple yet terrifying, was coming into focus. Each death had a pattern, each illness a method. But they also knew that exposure carried risk. The Delta's network of neighbors, each complicit through fear or convenience, could unravel the entire strategy with one misstep. As Rosa whispered, "The river always listens, and the land never forgets." The girls understood something fundamental. Their actions were creating a legacy, one that would echo beyond the Delta. They had become architects of dread, masters of perception and reality, and in that silence, Dinah's voice rose softly, almost a question. How far are we willing to go for memory? For revenge? The wind rattled the shutters. A crow cawed. Shadows lengthened across the floors, echoing every intention, every calculation. Somewhere beyond the levees, a new visitor approached the Whitmore estate, unaware that every footstep would be measured, every word potentially lethal, and then footsteps. Not theirs, but someone else's, moving through the hallways with purpose. What would happen when the outside world finally breached the Delta's shadows? The first knock on the front door that no one ignored would arrive in just a few hours. Secrets under the cypress. The humid air hung heavy, scented with wet earth and decaying leaves. In the fading light of October 25th, 1843, the Mississippi Delta shimmered with a strange orange-gold haze, the kind that made shadows deepen unnaturally. From the riverbank, the call of bullfrogs echoed across marshes, mingling with the distant clang of a ferryman's oar against rotting wood. On the Whitmore plantation, the triplets waited, perched on the staircase that overlooked the main hall, listening to the crunch of horse hooves along the gravel driveway. The sound was deliberate, steady, the heartbeat of impending change. Everything they had planned for months now hung in balance. Rosa, ever the observer, narrowed her eyes at the approaching figure, a man dressed in fine but worn clothing, his coat dusted with Delta mud. He carried a sealed ledger in one hand, the contents unknown but clearly important. Dinah's fingers twitched. Even small details could determine life or death. Sarah's notebook rested on her lap, the inked lines and diagrams mapping out contingencies should this visitor disrupt the delicate ecosystem they had curated. Neighbors had warned him away. A group of older plantation hands had crossed paths with him earlier in the day. They stepped aside silently, as if refusing to acknowledge him could somehow undo the reality of what they were about to witness. One servant whispered to another, "Don't look. Don't make it real." They knew the girl's reputation, yet they also feared the consequences of interfering. The stranger dismounted and approached the front steps. The triplets shifted as one, their eyes cold and calculating. Rosa's hand brushed against the railing, fingers tightening as though she could squeeze information out of the wood itself. The air felt electric, buzzing with tension that made the hair on the back of Dinah's neck rise. He spoke first, his voice low, practiced, but laced with a curiosity that betrayed him. "I hear whispers of your talents," he said. "I come with records of those who've disappeared." Rosa tilted her head, letting the words hang in the air. "Talents are dangerous," she replied softly. "Some say we practice them. Others say they choose us." The man smiled faintly, misreading her patience for weakness. He handed over the ledger, careful not to disturb the dust on the steps. "I only wish to know," he said. "The rest I leave to history." Pattern, observation, reaction. As Sarah flipped through the pages, the truth hit her with cold precision. Each entry chronicled families, debts, disputes, and deaths across the Delta. Dates matched, sometimes almost perfectly, with minor accidents and sudden illnesses. The ledger contained names Rosa had memorized months ago, details Sarah had mapped with surgical care. Every line was confirmation. They were being watched, cataloged, and yet unseen. The triplets had anticipated someone would eventually come seeking knowledge. Dinah leaned forward, studying the man's face. "Do you understand what you're holding?" she asked. "This is more than numbers. This is leverage. This is power." The stranger's gaze faltered. I didn't know it would be." His voice trailed off. He was not prepared for the full measure of their intent. He saw the small tools lined up on the mantelpiece. Vials, carefully labeled powders, sharp knives with inked symbols carved into their handles. The presence of these items spoke louder than words ever could. The air in the room thickened. Even the servants at the periphery of the hall shifted uneasily. A quote from the stranger's journal later, dated October 26, 1843, the air itself seemed alive. "The house watched me as much as I watched it." Their eyes threefold, never blinked. The triplets began to circle him, not menacingly, but with a quiet inevitability. Rosa's hand traced a line along the ledger's spine. "Do you understand the rules here?" she asked. "One misstep, and what you leave behind will be lost forever." The visitor hesitated. He had heard the rumors, of course the whispered tales of the Delta triplets, the deaths that no one could explain, the small towns that trembled when the Whitmore girls passed by. But rumor and reality were separate rivers, and now he stood at the Delta where they converged. What would you do if confronted by calculated intent? The air shifted further when Dinah stepped closer to the fireplace, gesturing at the embers. "History," she said, "has no mercy for those who ignore the margins. You might survive today, but every ledger you carry, every record you write, feeds the web we maintain." Sarah's notebook slid onto the floor, revealing more than casual observation. Diagrams detailing timing, plant toxins, and household movement schedules. The stranger realized suddenly that this was not just paranoia. The triplets had engineered events to maximize attention while minimizing exposure. Every accident, every illness, every suspicious death was a line in an elaborate equation, solved only by the girls themselves. A knock at the back door interrupted the tension. A delivery boy carried baskets of fruits and vegetables, common enough in appearance, but potentially critical to the household's operation. Dinah smiled faintly at the boy, who hesitated. He was part of the network, willingly or unwillingly, a courier of mundane items masking extraordinary purposes. "Leave it there," Rosa instructed, her voice low, carrying authority that chilled even the stranger. Time slowed, as the Delta itself seemed to watch. The river outside whispered against levees. Frogs croaked in discordant chorus, and the wind shifted through cypress branches as if carrying news. The stranger could not ignore it. Something in the house, in the air, in the eyes of the girls, insisted he recognize the true nature of what he had encountered. A sudden creak above startled everyone. The attic door, previously unnoticed, hung slightly ajar. Sarah's eyes flicked toward it. "Some things," she said, "should remain hidden. Others tested." The stranger moved to close it, but Rosa's hand shot out. "Leave it," she commanded. "History is patient. It waits for those who understand its language." Every instinct screamed at him to flee. Every logical thought argued restraint. And yet, curiosity held him in place. He did not see the knives, the powders, the small arrangements of herbs and roots that might change the outcome of a meal or a life. He did not see the pattern of eyes, the choreography of movements honed over years of survival and vengeance. Then, without warning, the triplets demonstrated the full weight of their control. A servant in the hallway stumbled. A subtle brush of a hand or a misplacement of a basket, perfectly timed to send him sprawling. The ledger slipped from his hands, pages scattering across the floor. Rosa's glance followed it, noting every page, every reaction, every flicker of fear. The stranger caught a single word from Sarah's whispered commentary. Observe. He realized that he was now part of the performance. And the performance was far from over. The Delta held its breath, waiting for the next move. The triplets advanced, and with each step, the stranger felt the full weight of their intent. Would the ledger reveal what the Delta wanted, or what the triplets chose to allow? Outside, the river continued its eternal whisper, indifferent to mortal fears. Within the walls, the triplets closed in, aware that knowledge itself could be as deadly as poison. Secrets in the shadows. The air in the Whitmore Plantation Library was thick with dust and the scent of aged paper. Sunlight slanted through tall, narrow windows, illuminating motes that danced like spirits above the scattered ledger pages. October 26, 1843, and the Delta was quiet, almost unnervingly so, except for the occasional call of a distant heron and the shuffle of the triplets' bare feet on creaking floorboards. Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah crouched over the ledger, their eyes sharp, measuring each detail with precision, while the stranger remained frozen in the corner, every muscle taut. Every entry in the ledger was more than a name. It was a story, a thread woven into a tapestry of the Delta's hidden violence. Crops failed, horses disappeared, small fires broke out in barns. Each event had been recorded by someone, somewhere, oblivious to the invisible hands that orchestrated chaos. Rosa's finger traced a line of names, stopping at one, Whitmore, James, October 9th, 1843. Cause unknown. She exhaled slowly. Our uncle, she whispered. The first to leave the plantation after. Her voice faltered, the unspoken completing the sentence. They all knew the pattern. One by one, their kin had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving whispers behind. Dinah leaned in, her voice low. Neighbors think it's something darker. They call it a curse, a shadow hovering over the Delta. But we know its method: observation, timing. She tapped the page with a slender finger. And this ledger confirms what we suspected. They were cataloging our steps, recording what we did before we could vanish from view. The stranger's hand trembled. He attempted to speak, to insert himself into the room, but Dinah's sharp gaze stopped him mid-word. Do you think anyone will save you if you interfere? She asked. His eyes darted to the doorway, to the faint outlines of servants, frozen like statues in the corners. Every bystander, every witness, had chosen passivity. Would you have intervened if you were them? The triplets moved with deliberate synchronicity, flipping through the ledger pages and extracting what they needed. Notes on medicine, plant toxins, and the timing of social gatherings were interspersed with mundane records of births, marriages, and local debts. Sarah whispered almost to herself. They try to make sense of chaos. But chaos has a teacher. Rosa paused over a set of entries, detailing a series of sudden illnesses on nearby plantations. Each symptom, she said, voice hushed, matches what we practiced years ago. The subtlety, the timing. Whoever recorded this didn't understand. Not truly. They only saw the surface. The stranger swallowed hard. But why? Why track it? Why leave evidence? His words cracked under pressure. Dinah's eyes were steel. Because humans are vain. They believe observation equals understanding. And perhaps, she added, they hope to catch the Delta triplets at our own game. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of the river and the decay of overripe fruit from the orchard. The ledger trembled in Sarah's hands, as if aware of the weight it carried. She laid it open on a table, drawing the stranger closer with an unspoken magnetism. Look here, she said. Do you see patterns? He leaned forward reluctantly. The entries traced a rhythm of disappearances, deaths, and minor misfortunes. Dates, times, and locations revealed a chilling choreography. 3 decades of gossip, myth, and whispered warnings coalesced into tangible evidence. The triplets were not merely rumored to be malevolent. They were architects of deliberate, unstoppable events. The stranger gasped. They knew everything. Everything, Rosa confirmed. And now we know what they want from us. The room was silent for a moment, filled only by the gentle rustle of ledger pages and the faint creak of the plantation settling under its own weight. Then Dinah spoke. Power lies in knowledge. The ledger is a map, but it is incomplete. Our family's deaths, our survival, it all follows a logic they cannot comprehend. Rosa nodded. They cataloged us like curiosities, but they didn't account for the choices we make, the actions we take outside their gaze. Control is an illusion. Sarah leaned closer to the stranger, her gaze intense. And now, she whispered, you are part of the record. Every moment you remain here, every breath you take in this house, is a footnote in the Delta's story. What would you do if every choice you made was observed, cataloged, and anticipated? Outside, a sudden rustling in the orchard drew their attention. Leaves skittered across the damp ground, kicked up by something moving unseen. The stranger froze, realizing the Delta itself seemed to respond to the triplets' will. Even nature obeyed a rhythm he could not decipher. A sudden crack echoed from the back of the library. The ledger shifted on the table as though reacting to an unseen force. Dinah's hand shot out to steady it, her touch precise, commanding. History, she said softly, bends to those who understand it. It punishes the unprepared. You, she said, fixing the stranger with a look, are unprepared. He tried to respond, to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Even as he tried to process the ledger's significance, a pattern began to emerge in his mind. Names, dates, and events aligned like a constellation. The triplets had orchestrated not just survival, but a legacy of influence, fear, and control. Sarah's voice cut through the tension. Do you see now why the neighborhood whispers? Why no one intervenes? Because understanding is terrifying. People prefer ignorance. They pretend the shadows are merely rumors. The stranger's gaze followed her hand as it traced a line through several pages. One name caught his eye. Whitmore, Sarah. The date matched a series of unexplained disappearances in the town records. Panic rose in his chest. He realized that, while he had been observing the Delta triplets, they had been observing him with far greater acuity. A single page slipped from the ledger, floating to the floor as if placed by an invisible hand. Rosa's voice was barely audible. Every action has consequence. Every witness has choice, and every ledger has a limit. Outside, the wind carried a faint wail, a sound half human, half animal, blending with the groan of the Delta marshes. It was the sound of history pressing in, of secrets that refused to remain buried. The stranger, now pale and shaken, whispered, Are they human? Dinah smiled faintly, the corners of her lips curving with the calm precision of someone who has already won. We are, she said, and that is why you fear us. The triplets began to close the circle around him. Their movement was slow, deliberate, unhurried, yet it carried the inevitability of fate. The ledger lay open on the table, silent witness to the unfolding moment. What would you do if the very record of your life became a trap? A clock in the hall chimed 4 times, marking the approach of evening. Shadows stretched longer, merging with the corners of the room. The stranger realized that the ledger, the house, and the triplets were not just observers. They were the arbiters of every outcome. Then, with a sudden, precise motion, Rosa reached out, picking up a quill and dipping it in ink. She made a single mark on the ledger, a line of intention that would ripple through the Delta, shaping events for months to come. The stranger understood then. He was not merely a witness. He was now part of the experiment. Secrets in plain sight. Dawn broke over the Mississippi Delta with a humid stillness that pressed against the skin like wet cloth. The scent of river mud and decaying vegetation hung heavy, mixed with the faint tang of wood smoke from distant cabins. September 29th, 1843. Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah moved silently along the levee, their bare feet sinking into the damp soil. The water lapped against the riverbanks in rhythmic slaps, a lullaby-turned threat. Their shadows stretched long and thin, merging with the early mist that crawled across the delta like a living thing. Earlier, neighbors had whispered about the recent string of family deaths, yet none had dared intervene. The triplets had learned early. Humans are capable of watching atrocities and convincing themselves they are irrelevant. But what if they weren't irrelevant? What if they were co-conspirators in silence? Rosa's hand grazed a patch of black moss clinging to a levee log. Her touch lingered, fingers tracing grooves worn smooth by decades of rain. "They say the river hides everything," she murmured. "But the truth is, it only reveals what it chooses." Dinah paused, squinting at the low morning Sunday. "And today, it chooses witnesses," she said. Across the delta, a wagon rattled along the mud-choked path, bringing a few curious onlookers nearer. They slowed, sensing something unnatural in the triplets' deliberate pace. The air hummed with tension, the smell of wet clay and iron sharp in their nostrils. Sarah's eyes caught movement in the distant reeds. A lone fisherman lingered, net in hand, pretending to mend it while watching the girls. His presence was almost comical if the stakes weren't so high. Their orchestrations required precision, timing, and silence, and human witnesses were unpredictable variables. She tilted her head. "Do we let them see, or do we vanish entirely?" Rosa smiled faintly. "Control requires risk. Let them observe. Let them fear. Let them remember." The delta swallowed sound in thick waves, but even here, the echoes of past violence lingered. The triplets' first victim had been a cousin, poisoned under the guise of illness. The second, a neighbor's son, taken down with a well-placed dose of bitter herbs. Each death had been methodical, deliberate, a demonstration of patience honed over 19 years of calculating survival in a system that demanded obedience. As they walked, Rosa reached into the folds of her skirt and withdrew a small, folded piece of paper, directions to a secluded cabin along the river where they stored the tools of their trade: powders, vials, and ledger copies. The paper trembled slightly in her hand, but her expression was unflinching. "Tonight, we continue what we began. They think the delta is theirs. They will learn otherwise." A dog barked in the distance, and the girls froze, not out of fear, but calculation. Dinah raised a finger to her lips, and all three paused, listening. The bark was followed by footsteps. A man, the sheriff from a neighboring parish, moving with deliberate caution. He'd heard the stories, as all men did. They whispered of 3 young women capable of evoking unnatural misfortune, capable of orchestrating death without touch or word. "Would you act," Dinah asked quietly, "if you believed the stories were true?" The question hung, unanswerable. The sheriff approached the levee, cane tapping against mud and roots. He carried authority, but also hesitation. The triplets had noticed over the years that power unaccompanied by understanding was ineffectual. He stopped a dozen feet away, squinting at the mist-shrouded figures. "Miss Whitmore, girls," he called. "You know the laws." Rosa's smile was small, almost courteous. "We know the law," she said softly. "But the law did not know us." The sheriff's voice faltered as he scanned the levee. "I have orders to..." "To watch?" Dinah interrupted, voice slicing through morning fog. "To stand and witness?" She stepped forward, and the mist seemed to cling to her, framing her like an apparition. "Then watch. And remember, nearby, A group of workers unloading cargo from a flatboat paused to gawk. Some whispered about the girls. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should intervene. None did. None would. Human complicity is often silence in the face of uncertainty. The triplets continued, now drawing nearer to the cabin hidden in a stand of willows. The smell of river silt and wet wood intensified as they passed beneath heavy branches dripping morning dew. Here, they kept a variety of powders and tinctures, bitters, herbal sedatives, and a few bottles laced with deadly intent. Tools of their trade, yet disguised as innocent implements. Sarah laid out the vials, arranging them with the precision of someone preparing a surgeon's table. "Timing is everything," she said. "One mistake, and the Delta claims more than our enemies. It claims us." Dinah consulted her journal, meticulously detailing events over the past month. Names, dates, illnesses, the ebb and flow of suspicion, all meticulously recorded. "They believe patterns belong to them," she said, "but patterns are ours, always ours." Rosa nodded, glancing toward the levee. The sheriff lingered still, pretending to examine a willow trunk, but his gaze followed every movement. Bystanders whispered among themselves, but no one stepped closer. Silence had become their accomplice, just as it had for decades. Sarah lifted a vial, holding it to the light. The liquid shimmered, almost innocuous. "Do you see how fragile control is?" she murmured. "All it takes is one moment, one choice, and the balance tips." The wind carried a faint scent of smoke, someone burning leaves in a distant field, and it mingled with the earthy aroma of the riverbank. The Delta seemed alive, responding to the triplets' presence. Their steps had rhythm, like a quiet drumbeat that others unconsciously followed. Suddenly, a shout pierced the morning. A man had ventured too close to the levee, drawn by curiosity or perhaps disbelief. He tripped over a hidden root and fell forward. The triplets paused, watching, calculating. The man scrambled up, coughing, and ran, convinced he had glimpsed something unnatural. Rosa exhaled, her breath steady. "Fear is a tool," she said, "and the Delta is patient enough to teach it." Dinah replaced the vials in their hidden compartments, and Sarah folded the journal carefully, tucking it into the skirts of her dress. They moved with quiet purpose back toward the levee, the river's murmur growing louder. Each footstep, each glance, a testament to the precision that had kept them alive and lethal for 19 years. The sun rose higher, burning off the mist and exposing the Delta in its raw, humid glory. Crops trembled under the heat. Birds scattered across the sky, and the river carried its usual cargo: sediment, debris, and the occasional secret. As the triplets disappeared behind the willow grove, the stranger who had been observing from the far bank scribbled notes furiously. Patterns, dates, actions, everything seemed to connect. He realized, with a cold understanding, that the Delta triplets were not merely survivors. They were orchestrators, architects of fear, and masters of the environment itself. What would you do if the very land around you became part of a strategy you could not fully understand? And as the levee returned to quiet, the Delta itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next calculated move. Whispers in the reeds. The wind through the willow trees whispered like distant conversations, dry leaves brushing against one another with a sibilant hiss. The smell of damp earth mixed with the metallic tang of river sediment, a scent that had marked the Delta for generations. September 30th, 1843. Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah crouched near the edge of the grove, hidden beneath hanging tendrils of willow, their hands busy preparing what would come next. Every movement carried purpose, honed over 19 years of observing, calculating, and executing. The cabin loomed quietly among the trees, more suggestion than structure. Smoke from the small hearth barely rose in the morning sun, curling like tentative fingers into the gray mist. Inside, A set of carefully organized vials waited, each labeled with meticulous handwriting. Bitter herbs, mild sedatives, and a few dangerous concoctions, all disguised as remedies for minor ailments. The triplets' knowledge of chemistry was precise enough to mimic disease, enough to make death look like an accident. Dinah knelt beside the small table, tracing the edges of a vial with her fingers. "Timing," she whispered. "That's our gift and our weapon. One wrong moment, one mistake, and the Delta claims us instead of them." Rosa moved to the window, peering through the thin willow branches. A neighbor passed nearby, hoe in hand, humming a tune that should have been cheerful. The triplets froze, recognizing instinctively that curiosity could be deadly not just for the observer, but for themselves. The man's ignorance was a form of complicity. What would you do if you knew something terrible was unfolding before your eyes, but couldn't understand it? Sarah opened a small ledger, revealing the painstakingly recorded observations of illness across the Delta plantations. Dates, times, and subtle behavioral changes in those who had unknowingly consumed their preparations. "We've taught the Delta patience," she said softly. "It waits for the right moment to reveal itself." Outside, the distant chatter of farmhands blended with the river's constant pulse. The Delta seemed to watch along with them, the water's surface shimmering with both sun and shadow. Every current could carry a secret. Every bend could conceal a danger. Rosa exhaled slowly, the air thick with humidity and the smell of moss. Their past successes had emboldened them, yet every action carried risk. The first victim that morning was a merchant from the neighboring parish, a man known for his cruelty and sharp tongue. He had underestimated the triplets, as all had, and had approached the cabin too closely. Dinah slipped a small vial of bitter-tasting tincture into his morning coffee, her hand steady, the liquid invisible in its glass. "You see, the Delta doesn't punish ignorance lightly," she murmured. Rosa's voice rose slightly above the ambient sounds. "Do they understand the consequences of their own curiosity?" She glanced at Sarah. "Or do they only know fear when it reaches their doorstep?" The triplets had learned over the years that observation was as lethal as action. The Delta was a stage, and every passerby, every servant, every overseer, was both audience and unwitting actor. The line between survival and execution was thin and often invisible. As the merchant left the cabin, a hand clasping his coffee too tightly, the triplets moved with precision. Every step was a ritual. Check the surroundings, hide the evidence, note the reaction. They had survived this long because their method was both invisible and absolute. A faint creak from the porch made them pause. Rosa's eyes caught a flash of movement. A young boy, no more than 13, had wandered close, carrying a basket of laundry. He froze mid-step, wide-eyed, uncertain whether to run or call for help. Dinah's voice was soft, almost maternal. "You will not speak. You will not act. Not yet." The boy nodded, eyes locked on hers, trembling with awe and fear. How much did the Delta allow its observers to see before it demanded silence? The triplets returned to the interior of the cabin, where vials and powders awaited the next phase. Their work required absolute attention, and yet their minds remained aware of the Delta's subtle warnings. A snapping twig, a distant shout, a bird taking flight. Every detail mattered. Later that evening, under the amber light of lanterns, they reviewed the day's events. Patterns emerged. Whispers in the cabins, subtle illness in selected targets, movements of neighbors that suggested knowledge, yet rendered them powerless. The triplets documented everything meticulously. Even mistakes were logged for learning and adaptation. A rustle outside drew their attention. A figure emerged from the mist. The sheriff from 2 parishes over, approaching with a lantern in hand. He stopped a few dozen feet away, peering at the cabin. Rosa stepped forward, shadows framing her face. "You've come far to see what you cannot understand," she said. The sheriff hesitated, aware that stepping closer risked more than mere confrontation. "What would you do?" Dinah asked softly, "if the very people meant to enforce justice were powerless in the face of truth?" The sheriff lowered his lantern slightly, uncertain whether he was in danger or privilege. The triplets allowed him a glimpse, a fraction of understanding, then turned back inside. Their message had been sent without words. Some truths were reserved for those who could survive them. Inside, the cabin smelled of herbs and damp wood, a mixture of life-sustaining and life-taking potential. Sarah organized the next batch of preparations, each vial labeled, each step carefully noted. "Control requires patience," she murmured, "and the Delta is patient." The night deepened, and with it the sense of imminent action. The triplets moved with silence, their presence both comfort and terror to the few who unknowingly observed. The river's whisper carried their decisions downstream, mingling with reeds, mud, and the Delta's own dark history. A letter left by a neighbor, who claimed to be afraid but curious, was folded and tucked into the ledger. It read in part, "I do not know what I have seen, but I cannot unsee it. Pray for mercy, for the land knows more than we do." The triplets read it together, eyes hard. Mercy was not a currency they could afford. Survival was, and it required both subtlety and daring. Rosa turned to Dinah and Sarah. "Tomorrow the Delta teaches another lesson," she said, "and we will be both students and instructors." As the lantern flickered, casting moving shadows across the cabin walls, the triplets prepared their final notes for the day. The Delta had been observed, and the pattern, as always, was invisible to those who did not know where to look. A whisper carried on the night wind. Willows shiver. The first light of October 1st, 1843, crept through the dense canopy of the Delta like a shy observer, casting long, fractured shadows across the cracked earth. Damp clay exuded a smell of decay and moss, the river in the distance gurgling like a restless sentinel. Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah emerged from their cabin, eyes scanning the horizon, muscles coiled like springs. Today's targets were different neighbors who had lingered too close, watched too long, and whispered too freely. Every whispered rumor was a thread in a web that the triplets intended to tighten. The Delta was alive with sound. The clang of blacksmith hammers at dawn, roosters crowing in impatient rhythm, the low moan of oxen pulling carts. For the triplets, it was an orchestra of opportunity. Each note could mask a footstep, cover the sound of a dropped vial, or drown out the gasp of an unknowing observer. They moved in synchrony, each step deliberate, their presence a shadow layered over the ordinary. Dinah stopped near a fence post, the wood rough beneath her fingers, the scent of sap heavy in the air. "We cannot falter, not for fear, not for observation, not for what's right or wrong, only for necessity." Sarah's eyes caught movement near the riverbank. A young woman, perhaps 17, collected water, humming a tune she didn't realize carried to the cabin. "She could see," Sarah whispered, "and see too much." What do we do when innocence becomes witness? Rosa approached the girl casually, carrying a small tin of herbs. She smiled, hands gentle. "Help me with this. The morning dew makes the ground slippery." The girl nodded, oblivious, trusting. Every act of teaching, of showing kindness, masked the undercurrent of intent that defined the triplets' world. Inside the cabin, preparations continued with meticulous precision. Vials were labeled, powders measured, herbs ground to the perfect consistency. A ledger recorded every action, every observation, every outcome of past endeavors. The triplets understood patterns. They understood consequence. The Delta responded to attention, to subtle nudges, to invisible influence, and the triplets were masters of its currents. A soft thump outside startled them. A neighbor's child had dropped a basket. Dinah froze, listening. The pause stretched, each second thick with tension. The child recovered quickly, pretending nothing had happened, the illusion preserved. Observation required patience. Control required secrecy. The delta demanded both. At mid-morning, the first subtle effects appeared. A neighbor complained of dizziness, another of nausea. Nothing overt, no screams, no collapse, nothing that would immediately draw suspicion. Just the faintest suggestion of illness, as if the land itself were whispering warnings no one could decipher. Rosa watched from the porch, noting how each reaction unfolded, adjusting future calculations with quiet precision. "What would you do," Rosa asked softly, "if the line between justice and vengeance was invisible to all but those who suffered?" The question hung in the warm delta air, unanswered, as if daring the land itself to respond. By noon, the shadows shifted differently. Sunlight struck through the willow branches, illuminating the cabin with a lattice of light and dark. Dinah and Sarah prepared a meal, ordinary to any observer, extraordinary in its hidden composition. Ingredients familiar, seasoning precise, every movement seemingly innocent. The delta continued its symphony, insects buzzing, river water lapping against muddy banks, the faint scent of distant smoke from neighboring chimneys. A visitor arrived unexpectedly, a merchant, known for his sharp tongue and suspicion of the triplets' activities. He approached the cabin cautiously, footsteps muted against the earth. Rosa greeted him with a smile that was both inviting and impossible to read. "Come, share some tea. The morning air is crisp." Inside, the vials waited in plain sight, each a promise of control, each a lesson in subtlety. Dinah poured the tea with practiced precision, a few drops of tincture hidden in plain sight. The merchant drank, oblivious, the delta's current carrying the invisible effects along its riverine pathways. Outside, the world continued as usual. Farmhands laughed, oxen strained against carts, and birds took flight in startled flocks. No one paused to question the slow unfolding of events, the gradual shift of power that the triplets orchestrated with such quiet skill. What would you do if danger was invisible, your life balanced on calculations no one around you could see? As the afternoon deepened, a storm rolled in from the west, wind rustling the willows, rain beginning to patter on the earth in a soft, persistent rhythm. The triplets welcomed it. The sound would mask footsteps. The smell of wet clay would confuse scent. The delta's moods would bend to their advantage. Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah moved outside under the light drizzle, each footstep measured. They gathered small branches, used the rain to mask movement, and carried out tasks that seemed mundane but were calculated for maximum effect. Observation was constant, adaptation instinctive. By late afternoon, subtle chaos had rippled through the neighboring plantations. Illnesses, disguised as coincidence, strange accidents, and whispered fears none overt enough to invite legal scrutiny. Yet every action, a lesson in the unseen power that the triplets wielded. Each day added to the legend, each act a seed, planted in the fertile, fearful soil of the delta. Evening came, the storm abating, leaving a heavy scent of wet earth and moss. Lanterns glowed faintly in the distance, signaling the return of laborers and the winding down of the day's work. The triplets reviewed their ledger again, eyes scanning each entry, noting patterns, observing results, planning for tomorrow. In the hush of approaching night, a sound caught their attention. A wagon moving along the distant road, horses clipping against the hardened mud. Rosa and Sarah exchanged glances, silently communicating decisions made without words. The delta, their teacher, was always watching, always recording, always offering lessons in timing and patience. Dinah traced a line in the dirt outside the cabin, her finger pausing at each mark. "We are the shadows here," she said softly. "The delta teaches, but it also protects. And we are learning every day. A lone owl called from deep in the woods, the note eerie, elongated, a sentinel's warning. Shadows stretched long across the earth, dancing with the flickering light of the cabin. The triplets extinguished the lanterns, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. The delta settled into silence, a current beneath the river, beneath the earth, beneath the eyes of those who believed they were in control. The ledger closed with a soft thump, a punctuation mark in the delta's dark narrative. Outside, the river glimmered faintly under the moonlight, a mirror to the triplets' careful manipulations, reflecting both intent and consequence. As night fully descended, the triplets lay in their beds, eyes open, listening to the delta breathe. Every creak, every whisper, every rustle was data. Every shadow carried meaning. Tomorrow, the lessons would continue, and the delta would respond again. Whispers in the willows. The air was thick with September's final warmth, a honeyed haze hovering over the Mississippi Delta at 6:15 p.m. on the 22nd day. Cicadas droned relentlessly, mixing with the clatter of distant wagons and the metallic clink of farm tools being stored. Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah stood at the edge of the family property, watching the sun tilt low behind the cypress trees, turning the river into liquid gold. Their eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon, anticipating the inevitable arrival of those who had begun to notice patterns too precise to ignore. The delta held its own kind of justice. Smell of damp leaves, the taste of iron in the water, and the feel of sticky mud underfoot told the triplets more than any whispering neighbor could. Today, it seemed, the delta itself had conspired to turn the tables. Men on horseback, strangers and familiar overseers alike, arrived with urgency in their eyes. Bystanders paused in the field or along the roadside, unsure whether to intervene or look away. And many looked away. They always looked away. What would you have done if you saw shadows moving with intent you could not understand? Rosa stepped forward, cloak heavy with the damp river air, and addressed the gathering crowd. Her voice carried over the delta's hum, strong and deliberate. We are here to settle accounts, not to be misunderstood. You watch us, you whisper, but the consequences of inattention are yours too. She held up a small vial, clear and ominous, refracting the last light of day. A murmur passed through the crowd. Some stepped back, others leaned closer. Curiosity and fear tangled together. The triplets' reputation had spread across the delta, whispered in the heat of the day, carried in the shadows of the night. People remembered deaths, unexplained sickness, the sharp decline of those who had crossed paths with the girls. Yet, none dared accuse them openly. Authority was slow to act, and the delta taught that fear could be more controlling than law. Inside the farmhouse, Dinah and Sarah prepared the evening meal with an almost ritualistic precision. Ingredients were laid bare, measured, and combined with an artistry born of necessity. Each gesture was deliberate, rehearsed. The house smelled of cornbread, strong coffee, and a faint bitterness from the herbs that lay hidden in plain sight. Their mother's old recipe books, worn and annotated, guided their hands, but tonight they were improvising. Rosa returned from surveying the edge of the property. She moved silently past bystanders who had chosen to ignore the unfolding events, as if their complicity somehow fueled the triplets' power. She whispered to her sisters, words meant only for them. Every observer is a variable. Every witness, an opportunity. Choose wisely. The first effects appeared within the hour. One of the men near the fence line complained of fatigue, claiming the delta sun had drained him. Another, leaning against a wagon wheel, felt a strange tightness in his chest. These were subtle, almost imperceptible signs, but the triplets watched with the patience of predators. Each reaction confirmed that their plan was succeeding without drawing immediate reprisal. At dusk, shadows lengthened unnaturally across the cabin. The girls gathered outside once more, now fully aware that the authorities would soon be on their trail. Dinah's eyes scanned the river, its surface reflecting every twitch of movement, every rustle in the reeds. "The river," she said softly, "knows what we cannot always see. We are part of it now." Sarah knelt and traced symbols in the dirt, relics of lessons passed down from whispered traditions, learned from whispered warnings. The markings were subtle, cryptic to the uninitiated, yet charged with meaning. They were not magic in the common sense, but a coded language of survival, a map of risk and control that the triplets had mastered. By the time darkness settled fully over the delta, the pursuing men had surrounded the property. Lanterns cast pools of yellow light that flickered across mud and grass, creating illusions of movement where there was none. The triplets moved with the confidence of those who know every creak of the floorboard, every secret path through the swamp, every shadow the delta could offer. Rosa stepped into the center of the yard, hands empty, body poised. "We have reached the moment," she announced. "You cannot see what you cannot perceive, and yet you chase us. How much of what you call justice is truly yours, and how much belongs to the fear you cannot name?" The men advanced. Lanterns swung, their reflections glimmering in the dark water of small channels cutting through the delta. Dinah produced a small jar from her belt, holding it to the faint light, while Sarah moved behind the group, eyes scanning for any hidden threats or opportunities. The crowd of bystanders, curious or complicit, watched silently, some wringing hands, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Suddenly, a lantern tipped, splashing light across mud and water. A scream pierced the night, startling the men who froze mid-step. In that instant, the triplets vanished into the shadows, slipping between trees, behind cabins, across the small creek that split the property. By the time the pursuers recovered, the girls were gone, leaving only disturbed earth, scattered leaves, and a lingering sense of unease. Whispers followed them into the night. Stories of strange sounds, of fleeting shadows, of the delta itself bending to their will. What had they carried with them? Vengeance, knowledge, survival. And where would they strike next? The community held its breath, caught between fascination and fear, unable to decide whether to hunt or honor what they had witnessed. In the days that followed, sightings spread like wildfire. Travelers along the river reported seeing 3 figures moving with unnatural coordination, always just out of reach. Journal entries of local planters recorded perplexing illnesses, strange accidents, and the whispering of something darker among the fields. October 25th, 1843. One diary entry read, "I swear I saw them near the old Cypress Bend, moving like shadows, eyes glinting. I do not know if they are alive or spirits of vengeance." Even the delta itself seemed to keep secrets. Currents carried faint traces of movement upstream, patterns only discernible to those paying close attention. Some claimed the river could be a weapon, a protector, a messenger. Others dismissed it as superstition. The triplets understood its language intuitively, allowing them to remain untouchable, their power amplified by the land itself. And yet, there was one question that lingered, unspoken but heavy. What would you have done if you were forced to wield such knowledge, such skill, in a world that refused to see your pain, your loss, your stolen life? Could survival alone justify the shadows you left behind? The delta settled into a rare stillness 1 week later, sun setting in a riot of reds and purples, mist rising from the river like ghosts of the past. Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah were gone, their presence lingering only in disturbed leaves, altered routines, and the quiet dread that anyone watching too closely might feel. Neighbors whispered that the girls had crossed the Mississippi into unknown territory, taking their legacy of fear and cunning with them. And yet, even now, some locals claim, decades later, that on humid September nights, the river carries faint footsteps, a rustle of fabric, a shadow flitting through the trees, and 3 figures. Always 3. Watching, calculating, waiting. Shadows never forget. The air in Chicago in early October 1875 smelled of soot, damp brick, and simmering broth. Rain pattered on the cobblestones outside the boarding house on State Street, its rhythmic tapping mixing with the soft clink of spoons against enamel bowls. Inside, Martha Washington, older now, moved deliberately through the kitchen, her scarred hands steady as ever, teaching a new generation of young cooks. Her voice was calm, even as the storm outside rattled windows. "The secret ingredient is always intention," she reminded them, stirring soup with a precision honed over decades. The Triplets story, or what remained of it, had traveled north through whispers and letters. Some said Rosa, Dinah, and Sarah had been seen along river towns, helping runaway slaves or guiding messages for abolitionists. Others claimed the girls had vanished entirely, leaving the Delta as silent and mysterious as ever. But Martha, once Clara, had carried that legacy into the city, hidden in plain sight. She had assumed a new identity, yet every choice she made, every recipe, every lesson, carried fragments of her past. Her boarding house became a refuge for those fleeing oppression. Black travelers, displaced families, and young women who had learned too late the value of vigilance. The smells of the kitchen, onions, molasses, pepper, and an undercurrent of iron from herbs and old tools spoke to her dual life. She taught her charges not just how to cook, but how to survive, how to hide knowledge behind normalcy. Every pot stirred, every loaf baked, became a lesson in patience, in planning, in using what others overlooked to their advantage. One evening, a young woman arrived at the boarding house. Clara Freeman, age 19, introduced herself with cautious grace. Her eyes, sharp and observant, reminded Martha painfully of her own daughters, now adults living far away, educated, free. Clara had come to study medicine in the only way available to black women at the time: apprenticeships and borrowed books. She moved with quiet purpose, absorbing everything Martha taught, from herbs' medicinal properties to how a pinch of understanding could heal or harm. Clara paused one night as Martha demonstrated the precise way to grind dried sage. "Why teach me this?" she asked, her voice small but insistent. Martha looked up from her work, glancing at the young woman with the patience of someone who had already seen the world's cruelty. "Because knowledge is power," Martha replied, "and power in the right hands can change the world." The two women, separated by a generation, continued in silence and concentration, forming a bond that was more than teacher and student. It was survival encoded into every gesture, every lesson, every deliberate act. Martha's scarred hands moved with both care and authority, a living map of past choices. She never spoke of Mississippi, of poison, of the Triplets' early terror. Yet the Delta's shadow hung in every corner of her kitchen, shaping the young woman who would carry that knowledge forward. Outside, Chicago was rebuilding from the Great Fire, smoke and sawdust mingling in the air, streets littered with both debris and opportunity. The city itself was alive with stories, with loss, with reconstruction, mirroring Martha's own work within the boarding house. Every evening, as the sun set, long shadows fell across the brick, reminding all who looked of past horrors survived and future challenges looming. The boarding house became more than a place to stay. It was a hub of clandestine education, quiet resistance, and careful preparation. The narrative of the Delta Triplets, once whispered in fear, now transformed into legacy. Grace and Patience Freeman had thrived in Canada, their mother's ingenuity allowing them to escape bondage. They had carried forward not only the skills taught by Clara, but also a cautious resilience, becoming educators themselves. They occasionally corresponded with Martha, their letters formal yet affectionate, each one a testament to survival and the careful use of knowledge. And yet, even in Chicago, there were echoes of past vengeance and ingenuity. One December morning, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside, a pressed magnolia blossom, faintly scented, and a note with a single line: "Intent is everything." Martha held it, inhaled the faint fragrance of the South, and understood instantly. The river had carried messages even to the north, reminders that some lessons could never be erased, only passed on. By 1885, Martha had grown frail. Her movements were slower, but her mind remained sharp, eyes scanning every gesture in the kitchen, every question posed by her students. That year, she carefully administered a final act of agency, ensuring that her death, peaceful and timely, would remain her own choice. Even in passing, she demonstrated the ultimate lesson: life, knowledge, and power could be managed with intention, even against the constraints of society. At her funeral, a figure appeared, cloaked and veiled, placing a single magnolia blossom on the coffin. Investigators would later identify her as Emma Whitmore, the youngest child spared in the Mississippi Delta, now grown, living a full life thanks to Clara's precise decisions decades prior. She left without a word, a silent acknowledgement of debts repaid, of survival secured. Martha's legacy had come full circle: the innocent saved, the guilty punished, knowledge transmitted across generations. Stories of the triplets' early crimes, their strategic poisonings, and eventual disappearance were now legend. Some details were confirmed, some embellished, and some lost entirely to time. Yet Chicago's boarding house stood as a testament to the same principles: preparation, vigilance, and careful use of power. Runaways and young women learned not only to cook, but to live deliberately, to measure every action, every word, every encounter. The kitchen became a crucible of survival, memory, and cunning, a direct continuation of the Delta lessons. Martha's death did not end the story. Clara Freeman, now well into her 20s, carried forward the knowledge, teaching not only culinary skills but strategy, observation, and resilience. She quietly ensured that families escaping oppression had both sustenance and the tools to survive. Over the years, letters, gifts, and subtle interventions hinted at an unseen hand, a reminder that power could be exercised with intelligence and foresight. Even in present day, local lore whispers of her influence. Some say that on humid nights, the scent of magnolia and simmering herbs drifts through abandoned kitchens, a ghostly reminder of lessons passed down by hands that had once wielded both poison and protection. Every flavor, every choice in the kitchen carries echoes of those long-gone hands. Deliberate, careful, unforgiving when necessary, but always meant to preserve life when it mattered most. In the end, the Delta triplets story was not just about vengeance or evil. It was about survival, intelligence, and the transmission of knowledge under impossible circumstances. Every act, every poison, every escape was a calculated step in a path few could understand. And in the hands of Martha Washington, and later Clara Freeman, that knowledge became a shield, a tool, a weapon, and a gift passed to those who could use it wisely. Some truths, Webb had once realized in his own notes, were never meant for the public eye. They were carried quietly, like currents in the river, guiding lives, influencing futures, teaching caution and strength. And so it continues. The legacy of the triplets, the Delta, and the women who survived their mother's methods lingers, unseen but potent, in kitchens, in classrooms, in whispers across rivers and cities alike. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.